What if you heard of little girl surviving a stormy river after being pushed off a wooden bridge by her own stepmother? 6-year-old Mabel Hart did. And when rescuers found her, there were 2 sets of footprints on the muddy bank, one small and one impossibly large. The truth? Mabel was saved by something the town had long believed was just a myth. Bigfoot, towering at nearly 10 feet, covered in wet brown fur. Its eyes weren't wild, but kind. And the girl? She holds the only key to exposing a dark secret buried deep within Gray's Harbor. Based on a real unsent letter, a forgotten bank vault, and whispers passed down by locals. This is the night they call the Night of 2 Footprints. You'll see the beast that held up an entire bridge in a storm, a broken detective who hesitated at the trigger, and a father who never truly left. If you think legends aren't real, this story might change your mind. But hey, before we dive in, where are you watching this from? I'd love to greet you properly in your language. The rain fell like fists on the canopy of old cedar and fir, each drop a cold reminder that the world didn't care who you were, how small you were, or whether your heart still believed in rescue. Thunder cracked, sharp and sudden, echoing off the bluff over the Humptulips River, shaking the loose stones under the tired wood of the old bridge. It had been there longer than most of the town's memories, sagging in the middle, patched with rusted nails and prayers. And on this bridge, in the gray dark of a storm-choked night, a little girl stood, barefoot, legs trembling, her white cotton dress soaked through and clinging to her knees. Mabel Hart was 6. She didn't know why her stepmother had brought her here, only that Marjorie had been silent the entire drive. No lullabies, no soft sighs, just windshield wipers screeching across glass and the occasional hiss of tires on wet gravel. Now Marjorie's hand was at her back. Too firm, too cold. A push, not gentle, not curious. A push with intention. The wind lifted Mabel's curls, and the hem of her dress danced like it was trying to fly away. The river below was swollen with runoff, black water foaming white around rocks, crashing against tree limbs caught in its fury. Mabel turned to speak, to ask why, but Marjorie's face was already cast in stone. Her eyes were a distant storm, then the shove. It wasn't theatrical, it wasn't loud. It was the quiet violence that happens when someone has made up their mind. 1 second Mabel was there, the next she wasn't. The cold bit first. Not the surface shiver of a chilly day, but a deep stab that locked her lungs and clawed into her spine. The river was a monster. It sucked her down, turned her sideways, spun her in a whirl of limbs and gasps. The white dress bloomed like a dying flower beneath the surface, then vanished. Her world was water and sky and water again, flashing in nauseating turns. She reached for anything: air, roots, her daddy's hand, her wooden horse. But the river didn't care about fathers or toys or children with crooked legs. Her mouth opened, the water rushed in, then something changed. Not the river, not the storm, something else. A shadow moved along the bank, massive and deliberate. Trees didn't sway like that. Wind didn't breathe like that. Mabel's limbs were slowing, her thoughts starting to flicker like the porch light back home when the power line swayed in the wind. She stopped fighting. She was too small. The world was too big. And then fingers, large, rough, covered in something warm and coarse but not unfriendly. A hand so big it could have held her whole head without trying. It didn't yank her, it lifted. Slowly, carefully, as if she were glass and the world had already cracked her once. She came up coughing. Grass brushed her cheek. The river was behind her now, roaring its anger. Rain beat against the reeds, but she was out of its reach. Someone, or something, had pulled her from its grip. There was warmth under her, a pile of moss dry beneath its top layer, reeds bent and tucked like a nest. The heavy press of something watching, then gone. No footsteps, no sound. only the rhythm of rain and the drumbeat of her heart. In the brush, a figure paused. Broad shoulders. Tall, too tall for any man. Arms long enough to brush the ground. Eyes caught the faint light of the storm like two forgotten lanterns in the woods. It didn't speak. It didn't growl. It breathed, low and slow. A sound like the forest itself exhaling after holding its breath too long. And then it was gone, swallowed whole by the rain and the night. Miles away, under a canopy of tangled branches and bitter memory, Caleb Merritt stirred from his sleep. The fire in his stove had gone out hours ago, but something had woken him, an old instinct sharpened by years in the wilderness. He slipped on his boots, reached for the lantern, and stepped into the storm without a word. The rain had already turned the dirt to soup, but his eyes were trained for this. Broken reeds, crushed moss, a trail of something big, and beside it, smaller prints. Too erratic, too fragile. A child. He followed the signs until they disappeared at the river's edge. That's when he saw her. A pale shape slumped against the rocks. Tiny, barefoot, breathing. He rushed to her side, scooping her up in arms that hadn't held another human in years. Her lips were blue. Her body shook, but she was alive. Back at the cabin, Caleb wrapped her in a threadbare quilt, stoked the fire until it roared. She didn't speak at first, just stared at the flames like they were speaking a language only she could hear. He watched her without questions. Sometimes answers came faster when you didn't ask. When she finally did whisper, her voice was the sound of leaves brushing against a window. "Someone pulled me out." He paused, mid-sip of coffee. "Someone," she nodded. "He was big, but he didn't scare me." Caleb didn't speak for a long time after that. But later, when he stepped outside to empty the kettle, he saw them. Deep, impossible tracks in the mud leading away from the cabin, fading toward the pines. Something was out there, something that had made a choice. The next morning, the rain still fell in soft sheets, but daylight filtered through the trees in silver strands. Caleb had dried the girl's clothes by the stove, carefully avoiding the delicate embroidery along the collar. As he folded the dress, something slipped out. A small square of cloth, a handkerchief. White, now damp and smudged with dirt. But the initials stitched in blue thread were still legible. T.H. Caleb sat with it a long time, holding it like a relic. Tobin Hart. The name stirred something old and unfinished. A story whispered in mining camps and backroom bars. A man who'd vanished in the smoke and fire of an underground collapse. Rumors had said he ran. Others claimed he was murdered for knowing too much, but none had said he'd left behind a daughter. The fire crackled. Mabel slept beside it, one arm tucked beneath her cheek, her breath soft and slow. Caleb sat in the rocking chair across from her, knees aching from the cold, mind racing with questions he'd buried long ago. He stared at the child's small face, at the quiet way she existed even in sleep. Outside, just beyond the tree line, the woods whispered again. Not wind, not storm, but breath. The kind you could feel in your chest before you ever heard it with your ears. Caleb stepped to the window. Rain traced silver veins down the glass. The forest beyond was still, but something moved, just a shadow. Just the absence of light where light should be. He blinked. Gone. When he turned back to Mabel, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, soft brown pools of confusion and trust. "Do you have a horse?" she asked suddenly. He blinked. "No, ma'am. Haven't had one in years." She sat up slowly, wincing as she shifted her legs. One was slightly twisted inward, the knee swollen, the skin scarred in a way that said she was born fighting gravity. "I have one," she said. "He's small, wooden. My dad made him. He said it's for luck." Caleb nodded. "That so?" She nodded back, solemn as a judge. "But it's not here." He searched the folded clothes again, more carefully this time. until his fingers brushed smooth wood beneath a torn hem. He pulled out the toy, carved with precision, worn at the edges, the kind of thing someone didn't just make, but made with love. When he handed it to her, she clutched it tight. Then her eyes widened. "There's something inside," she said. She turned it over, shook it gently. A soft clink came from within. Caleb fetched his knife and worked at a seam in the wood until the back popped open with a faint crack. Inside, nestled in a hollowed-out belly, was a folded scrap of paper and a key no bigger than a thumbnail. The paper was brittle but legible. "Harbor Savings, Box 9C. He read it again and again. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, something had begun to change. The fire crackled louder. Mabel leaned against the arm of the chair, toy horse in her lap, eyelids growing heavy. Caleb stayed by the window, hand still holding the key, heart thudding in a way it hadn't in years. In the woods beyond, the trail was gone, the prints erased by wind and water. But the presence remained. It always did, a promise written in moss and silence. And deep in the forest, where the mist hung low and the trees leaned like they were listening, something enormous breathed once, and then vanished into quiet. The night wasn't done. Not yet. And the story was only just beginning. The morning came slower in the woods. Not because the sun was shy, but because the trees were tall and stubborn, and they liked to keep the light to themselves. Inside the cabin, the fire still glowed low in the stove, its warmth pushing back the last grip of the cold night. The smell of wet earth clung to the air, mixing with cedar smoke and something gentler, like wild mint crushed underfoot. Mabel stirred beneath the quilt, eyes still heavy with sleep, but her fingers clutched the wooden horse so tight it seemed like part of her hand. Caleb stood by the window, watching the world wake up in pieces. He didn't move when he heard her cough, didn't turn when she whispered his name. She said it like she'd known it longer than a night. He didn't correct her. She tried to sit up. Her leg, the twisted one, dragged behind as she shifted, awkward but practiced. He saw the flicker of pain, but also the grit behind it. She didn't ask for help, just blinked hard and studied the room like she was learning it by heart. The cabin wasn't much. One room, a cast-iron stove, a table with a single chair, walls built from timber blackened in spots like old bruises. There were places where the wood looked melted, warped and blistered, frozen mid-scream. Near the corner, a patch of floor was newer, slightly raised, as if trying too hard to forget the fire. Mabel pointed at the wall with her small chin. "What happened there?" Caleb didn't answer right away. His fingers traced the edge of the curtain, rubbing fabric that used to belong to a shirt he hadn't worn in years. He didn't look at her when he spoke. There was a time this place had more than one voice. He didn't offer more. Mabel didn't ask again. The rain had slowed to a whisper by mid-morning, and Caleb moved like a man who'd learned how to keep his weight quiet. He made oatmeal, burnt at the bottom, but warm, and added a drizzle of honey saved for winter. Mabel ate in slow, careful bites. She was silent, but her eyes were sharp, scanning every object like it might explain something the world had kept from her. When she was done, she wiped her mouth with the sleeve of the flannel shirt he'd let her wear. 2 sizes too big. Sleeves rolled and knotted like she was pretending to be someone bigger than herself. Later, she found a pencil stub and a blank scrap of receipt paper on the floor. She started drawing without asking. Caleb only noticed when he saw the way her hand moved in tight, deliberate circles. A horse, and next to it, a stick figure holding a flower. Then a taller one behind, arms raised, not menacing but watching. He stepped outside, needing air, and found himself standing near the tree line again. Something was there, not visible, just present. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out the handkerchief again. T.H. The letters felt heavier now. He didn't know much about Tobin Hart. Not really. But the name rang through old parts of his mind like a bell someone buried long ago. Hart had worked the mines down in North Creek, if memory served. Bright guy, kept to himself. But something had gone wrong. There'd been an explosion. Men dead. Rumors. Talk of sabotage. And then Tobin vanished. Just gone. No body, no funeral. The kind of disappearance that left behind more stories than facts. He walked the perimeter of the cabin like he always did after a storm. The earth was soggy, the pine needles slick. No prints today. No sign of their quiet visitor. But the wind carried a smell he couldn't place. Animal, maybe. Or earth turned over too fast. Back inside, Mabel was asleep again, curled like a question mark beside the stove. The wooden horse had rolled from her hands, come to rest beneath the table. Caleb bent to pick it up. Something rattled. He turned it over in his palms. The wood was solid, hand-carved, stained dark in the creases. It looked like the kind of thing someone spent hours making, not for show, but because they had no other way to say, "I love you." He shook it again. A faint clink from inside. He fetched his pocket knife and sat at the table, angling the blade with the kind of patience that only came from too much time alone. The back panel of the horse loosened with a pop. Inside, nestled against splinters, was a key the size of a thumbnail, silver, still shiny. And next to it, folded in thirds, was a scrap of paper faded yellow with age. He unfolded it slowly. Harbor Savings, Box 9C. His breath caught somewhere in the middle of his chest. He leaned back, staring at the paper like it might blink. Harbor Savings was a bank in town. Still there, still operating under the same rust-colored sign. And Box 9C wasn't a name. It was a safe deposit number. The sound of boots on gravel broke the silence. Caleb froze. Not footsteps, tires, a car. He moved to the window and peeked through the warped glass. No car. Not yet. Just nerves. Mabel woke around noon. Her eyes found him instantly, like she'd known where he was before she even looked. She reached for the horse. He handed it back wordlessly. She tilted it, listening. "I heard it too," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "How'd you know to look inside?" "My dad told me once," she said, brushing her fingers along the mane. "He said, if I ever got lost, follow the sound that doesn't belong." Caleb sat down slow. Sound, like metal, not wood. She tapped the horse's belly. It wasn't part of him. The girl was sharp, sharper than most grown men he'd met in his life. He didn't know what to do with that. Out past the hills, the day turned colder. The sun stayed behind the clouds like it was hiding from something. At the edge of town, in a house too clean for the kind of grief it pretended to hold, Marjorie Hart poured herself another cup of tea, steam curling around the corners of her sharp mouth. She was on the phone. Her voice was soft, breaking at the right places. The woman on the other end, station manager probably, nodded sympathetically without realizing she was being used. "I just want her found," Marjorie said, her hand trembling exactly how she'd practiced in the mirror. "She's all I have left of him." She dabbed her cheek with a tissue. No tears, just the idea of them. The television in the corner showed a clip of the bridge. The word "missing" blinked in red beneath a photo that didn't quite match the girl anymore. Marjorie sighed, closing her eyes. She had to be careful now. Too many eyes. Too many ears. Back in the woods, Caleb boiled water for tea he didn't intend to drink. Mabel watched the flames dance inside the stove's belly. "Was that your family?" she asked, pointing at the wall. He didn't answer. But this time, she didn't let the silence hold. "My mom used to say fire is greedy." Caleb stirred the water. "She said it doesn't just take what's burning. It takes the air, the memories." He looked at her. "She's gone," Mabel said. He waited for the tears. None came. Mabel pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "Did you love them?" she asked. Caleb stared into the pot like the leaves might answer for him. "I did," he said. "Still do?" He looked out the window. "I never stopped." The air inside the cabin shifted. like the place had heard something it wasn't ready for. Outside, the forest creaked. Not loud, not sudden. Just a reminder that it was always there, watching, breathing, waiting. That night, after Mabel fell asleep with her arms wrapped tight around her horse, Caleb sat by the stove with the scrap of paper and the key between his fingers. The letters swam in the firelight. Harbor Savings, Box 9C. He knew what had to come next, but part of him didn't want to go back to town, didn't want to face what had changed, or what hadn't. Mabel stirred in her sleep, murmuring something he couldn't quite hear. A name, maybe. Or a place. Her fingers twitched like she was reaching for something just out of reach. He stood, gently tossing another log on the fire. Outside, the trees didn't sleep. They leaned in, whispering things no man could understand. And somewhere, far past the edge of the clearing, something breathed again. Not like a man, not like a beast, but something in between. Like the forest itself had lungs, and it was exhaling slowly, deliberately, just to remind the world it was still here. And it was listening. The forest disappeared by morning, not because it was gone, but because the fog came in like a secret, thick, milky, crawling low across the ground like it didn't want to be seen moving. It blanketed everything, even sound. There were no birds that day, no rustle of squirrel claws or crackle of dead pine, only that soft, hanging silence that made every breath feel borrowed. Mabel pressed her face to the window pane, her breath fogging the glass from the inside as the world outside vanished inch by inch. The trees had edges yesterday. Today they had only suggestion. She didn't speak, just watched. Her fingertips moved slowly along the condensation, tracing lines that looked like rivers, like veins, like something inside trying to get out. Behind her, the cabin ticked and creaked with its usual aches, but quieter somehow. Caleb moved through it with the same heaviness he always carried in his joints when the pressure dropped, but he didn't complain. He never did. He poured hot water over the bitter grounds and let it sit while he added another log to the fire. Outside, somewhere behind that white curtain, something moved. The fog didn't part. It just shifted. So slightly it could have been the wind, except there was no wind. Mabel turned to him then, slowly. "It's him," she said. Caleb didn't answer, but his hand paused just long enough to let her know he was listening. "He doesn't want anything," she said softly. "He just watches." He stepped to the window beside her. The trees were faint smudges now, like charcoal lines blurred by a careless thumb. Then something darker shifted between them. Not fast, not startled. Just present. He said nothing, but when he went out to check the traps later, he found them all untouched, except for the one closest to the cabin. That one was open, and inside, nestled on top of the bent trigger, was a bundle wrapped in broadleaf. Fish, cleaned, gutted. Still cold. Next to it sat a canteen, handmade, carved from polished birch and bound with twine, the stopper whittled into the shape of a bird's head. He turned it in his hands. The craftsmanship was impossible. Too clean, too practiced, like someone had spent years learning how to make it for no one but themselves. He brought it inside and set it on the table without a word. Mabel's eyes widened. She reached for the canteen slowly, her small hands brushing its surface like it might vanish if she touched it wrong. "He left it," she whispered. Caleb nodded. "I think he wants to help." The fog held for hours. It moved in pulses, breathing with the forest. Sometimes thinner, sometimes thick again. Caleb opened the window slightly, just enough to let the air speak. It didn't say much, but it said enough. Down in Gray's Harbor, the town stirred with a different kind of tension. Wade Corbett leaned against the hood of his truck, cigarette burning too fast between his fingers. The flyer in his hand was damp, the ink bleeding slightly at the corners. Mabel Hart, 6 years old. Missing since Tuesday. Last seen near the Humptulips Bridge. His jaw clenched. He wasn't doing this for the money. Not really. The woman who'd hired him, Marjorie, had too much perfume and not enough soul. But something about the girl in the photo had caught him. The expression on her face wasn't just childhood. It was something else. Something familiar. He'd had a daughter once, Eliza, cerebral palsy. Couldn't speak without blinking to spell out words on the board he made. She died before he could tell her sorry, before he could fix how he ran. So when Marjorie asked him to dig around, he said yes. But every step of this case itched in his gut. The mother's grief didn't ring right. Too public, too rehearsed. And the deeper he went, the less he believed her. The report from the bridge was thin. No eyewitnesses. Just tire marks on the gravel. A piece of white fabric snagged on a rusted nail. No one checked the woods. Not really. Just a sweep, some calls, then a press conference. He flipped the flyer over and scribbled 2 words on the back. Find Evelyn. He had a hunch. Meanwhile, Mabel sat at the table, the canteen resting beside her, the wooden horse in her lap. She wasn't hungry, but she watched Caleb clean the fish like it was magic. His hands moved slow, not because he was old, but because he believed in not rushing what deserved time. She stared at the fire, then spoke without turning. My dad said if I ever got lost, I had to look inside. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Inside what? Inside myself. He didn't speak, just waited. He said the light in your chest is like a lighthouse. Even if no one else sees it, it'll find you if you don't blow it out. He said nothing again. Later that afternoon, she asked him to show her how to listen to the woods. He smiled, just barely. You gotta be real quiet first, he said. Quieter than your own thoughts. They stepped out onto the porch. The fog had thinned, but not much. The air hung heavy, wet like wool. He sat down on the step. She mimicked him. Now close your eyes, he said, and don't try to hear anything. Just let the sound come to you. She obeyed. For a long time, nothing. Then, drips, raindrops falling from the high branches to the lower ones. The hush of leaves adjusting under weight. A low whistle of something gliding through the air. Maybe an owl. Maybe not. And beneath it all, a rhythm. Faint. Not human. Not threatening. Just steady. Like a heartbeat echoing in the soil. Her breath caught. I hear him, she whispered. Caleb opened his eyes but said nothing. He's not close, but he's not gone. The next day, they began to plan. Not grand plans, not schemes, but intention. Caleb pulled the key from the hidden drawer he'd slid it into. Ran his thumb over the metal. Mabel reached for it, holding it in her palm like it might unlock more than a box. They would have to go into town, to Harbor Savings, to Box 9C. The thought made Caleb's stomach tighten. He hadn't been back in years. Not since. He shook the memory loose. In town, Wade parked outside the old bank and walked in without a jacket, the cold biting through his sleeves. Evelyn Pike sat at the front desk, silver hair pulled into a twist, glasses low on her nose. She was reading a romance novel and didn't look up until he cleared his throat. I need to ask you something about a client, he said. She raised an eyebrow. You got a warrant? No, he said. But you got a heart? She sighed, closed the book, and leaned forward. I'm listening. That night, Mabel lay on the floor beside the stove again. The blanket wrapped around her shoulders like armor. The wooden horse rested beside her. Caleb sat nearby, the map of town spread out on the table. We go early, he muttered, before the shops open. She didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the flame. Then she spoke low. If he's watching, he'll know. Caleb turned to her. Know what? That I'm not running away, she said. I'm running towards something. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. Outside, the fog had lifted just enough to see the shape of the woods again, but not enough to forget what it had hidden. The trees stood tall, unmoved. The wind didn't blow, but somewhere out there something watched the light in the cabin window. Not as a threat, but as a promise. It would follow, if needed, and it would wait, as long as it took, because the forest didn't forget the ones it saved, and it never turned its back on those who listened when no one else did. The rain didn't wait for permission that morning. It came without rhythm, light at first, then louder. Scattered applause on rooftops, drums on canvas tents, a dull thud against cotton candy machines covered in clear plastic. It soaked the gravel roads, turned the dust to syrup, made boots stick and slip and swear. But the county fair still happened. It always did. Rain or shine. That was the promise. That, and the smell of kettle corn, grease, hay, and cheap beer weaving through wet air like it had nowhere else to go. People came with umbrellas and ponchos, coats too thin for October and smiles too forced for the weather. Children tugged their parents toward booths with dart games and sad balloons, toward stuffed bears with matted fur and paint-chipped horses that went around and around but never got anywhere. Music played from a tinny speaker nailed to a pole, some old country song that didn't care if it was heard. It mixed with the squeal of rides and the echo of announcements no one listened to, and in the middle of it all, she walked, small, limping slightly, a raincoat too big for her frame, clear and shapeless, clinging to her legs like cellophane. Underneath, boots too old and too small, but she walked steady. Not fast, not slow, just moving, like the rain couldn't reach her even as it soaked her hair flat. People glanced, then looked again. Not because she was strange, but because she wasn't. Because something about her didn't fit this world of funnel cakes and prizes, like she was carved out of a story that wasn't finished yet. Caleb walked behind her, a few paces back, hat pulled low, collar turned up. His boots made no sound in the mud. He watched every direction, every face, every too curious glance. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were here for one reason. Harbor's Savings sat at the edge of the fairgrounds, just past the old fire station, its stone face damp and dark like it had never dried properly. Inside, it smelled of paper, carpet glue, and the kind of secrets that had grown too old to whisper. Evelyn Pike was at her post, always was. Her glasses sat low on her nose, and her cardigan sleeves were pushed up just enough to reveal a faded ink mark on her wrist. She watched them enter with the quiet calm of someone who'd seen too many years and still chose kindness. Mabel stepped forward and held out the key. Her fingers trembled just slightly. "Box 9C, she said. Evelyn looked at her, then at Caleb, then back at the key. Her breath caught. She said nothing for a long moment. "You two come with me," she said, standing slowly. They followed her down the hall lined with safety posters and a dusty bulletin board filled with notices 3 seasons out of date. The vault room was colder than it should have been. The air was heavy, like it knew what it held. Evelyn unlocked the door, waved them inside, then closed it behind them. The click echoed sharp. The box was where it had always been. 3rd row from the bottom, far left. The number etched faintly on a brass plate, 9C. Caleb inserted the key, turned. Inside was a manila envelope, thick and bowed from the contents. He pulled it out gently, as if afraid it might scream. They sat at the small metal table in the corner. Mabel leaned close. Caleb opened the envelope. Inside was a cassette tape, old and worn, the label handwritten in black marker. T. Hart, 1996, account record. Beneath it, a folded legal document. Caleb opened it. His breath stuck. A letter of authorization, dated, signed. It bore Tobin Hart's name, but not just his. For bearer, it read. The bearer. Whoever held this had access to the full payout of Tobin's mine insurance policy. 1.2 million still active, not claimed. Caleb looked at Mabel. She didn't understand yet, but she would. He picked up the tape, turned it over in his hands. "We need a player," he muttered. Evelyn knocked softly and opened the door just enough to slide her head in. "You'll want this," she said. holding out an old cassette player. Dusty, battery-powered. He nodded once, took it. He clicked the tape in, pressed play. Static, then breathing, then a voice. Tobin's voice. If you're hearing this, something went wrong. I don't know who's listening. But I hope it's someone who gives a damn. The voice cracked, cleared, continued. They were stealing from the fund. Marjorie was part of it. So was Grissom from the board. I have the records. I tried to stop it. Then the explosion. He paused again. They told me to disappear. Said if I didn't, Mabel would be next. My daughter, my blood. The tape hissed. Caleb shut it off. Mabel's lips parted, her eyes wide but dry. Outside the vault, something slammed. Evelyn rushed in, her face pale. You have to go, she whispered. Now. What happened? She's here, with police. Caleb stood. Who? Marjorie. Mabel froze. Evelyn moved fast, faster than her age. She yanked the fire alarm lever by the door. The siren screamed through the building. Lights flashed. Caleb grabbed the envelope, the tape, the letter, Mabel's hand. This way, Evelyn said, pointing toward the emergency exit. They burst out into the alley behind the bank, steam rising from the manhole grates. Sirens from the fire trucks began to growl in the distance. False response to a false alarm. The fair had turned chaotic. Music still played, but now it clashed with voices, with metal against metal, with people ducking under wet tents and running for cover. Caleb pulled Mabel into the crowd. She limped but didn't slow, her hand in his like a tether. Behind them, Marjorie pushed through the crowd, lips curled, eyes scanning. Two officers flanked her, confused but compliant. That's her, she screamed. He took my daughter. Wade stood to the side, half hidden behind the popcorn stand. His eyes found Mabel, then Caleb, then Marjorie. He stepped forward. One of the officers turned. You a witness? Wade pulled his badge from his coat pocket. Private investigator, been following this case since Tuesday. Marjorie smiled, too wide. Then tell them what you saw. He nodded. I saw you lie, he said. She blinked. I heard the tape, he added. You stole from Tobin. You staged his death. You tried to erase a little girl for money. The officers turned toward her. You don't know what you're talking about, she snapped. He's crazy. But her voice cracked in the wrong place. One of the officers reached for his radio. Code 31, requesting backup. Marjorie stepped back, eyes darting. And in that moment, thunder cracked overhead. Not a sound. A break. Mabel turned. And through the crowd, at the edge of the fairgrounds, standing beneath the dripping trees, he was there. Not in shadow, not hidden. Still, tall. Watching. Bigfoot. People didn't notice. Too busy, too loud. But Mabel did. Caleb did. She held her gaze steady. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't roar. He just stood, like an old tree that had seen too much to speak. Caleb turned back just in time to see Marjorie bolt. But she didn't get far. Wade reached out and caught her wrist. She tried to twist free. Don't, he said. You're done. The sirens grew louder. Mabel stood in the mud, dress soaked, face calm. Caleb knelt beside her. You okay? She nodded once. I think we're going to be. They walked away before the crowd could realize what had happened. Slipped between tents and out the side gate. Caleb still held the envelope. Mabel still held his hand. And behind them, the fair returned to noise. But above it all, beyond the crowd, the rain fell steady, and something ancient watched it fall like it always had. The rain came back harder than before, thick and wind-driven, pushing sideways like it was trying to scrape the land clean. Branches whipped, leaves tore loose, and the sky turned the color of bruised steel. The kind of storm that made animals go quiet and people second-guess their plans. But plans had already been set in motion, and by the time they reached the Humptulips Bridge, there was no turning back. The bridge groaned beneath their boots. Wooden planks swollen from decades of storms. Iron bolts rusted orange, every step giving just a little more than the last. The wind whipped through the slats in the side, humming low like something breathing. The river underneath had grown wild again. its current frothing with debris and runoff, smashing against the wooden supports with a sound like something breaking again and again. Mabel clutched the envelope to her chest, the rain slicking her hair against her forehead, her legs unsteady but still moving. Caleb stayed in front of her, blocking most of the wind, his frame hunched, jaw locked tight. The bridge stretched long ahead of them, longer than it had yesterday, it seemed. At the far end, the trees bent and swayed like they were trying to turn back, and from behind them came footsteps, fast, angry. Marjorie's voice cut through the storm like a knife. "Stop right there." Caleb turned slowly. She was standing just past the threshold, soaked but composed, the kind of composed that trembles underneath. 2 officers flanked her, unsure, caught in something they didn't understand. One reached for his radio. The other stepped forward, but she raised a hand. "Don't," she snapped. "They have my daughter." The wind pulled her coat back, revealing the gun she held low in her right hand. It wasn't shaking. Mabel's breath caught in her throat. Caleb stepped sideways, positioning himself between the girl and the threat. "We're not running," he said. "We've got proof." She laughed, sharp, cold. "That tape? That won't hold. That letter? Worthless. You're a drifter, and she's a child. No one believes children." The bridge creaked louder. One of the planks gave a tired sigh under her weight. The officers exchanged looks. Wade's voice came from behind her. "Don't do this." She spun. He stepped forward, slowly, palms up. His coat was drenched, his face pale but steady. "You've lost," he said. "That tape's already been duplicated. The insurance company has it. So does the FBI. This ends now." Marjorie's hand didn't lower. Her eyes flicked back to Mabel. "She's not your concern," she hissed. "She was never supposed to survive." Then the gun shifted, lifted. Mabel flinched, and the bridge shook. Not from the storm, from something else. A sound came, low and heavy. Wood straining, not just from above, from below. Caleb turned fast. Behind them, near the center of the bridge, the boards had begun to bow. Rainwater poured through the cracks. And there, gripping the main support beam from underneath with both massive hands, was something that did not belong in any police report or fairy tale. He held the bridge. Bigfoot. Not in shadow, not in legend. Here, now, drenched, towering, muscles tense like coiled rope beneath soaked fur, eyes locked forward, not blinking, holding the bridge up with his body. The wind screamed louder. One of the officers stumbled backward, hand going to his mouth. Caleb stepped in front of Mabel again, and Marjorie froze, her gun still up, but her face cracking. He didn't roar. He didn't lunge. He just stared, straight into her, as if seeing every lie she'd ever told. Her fingers trembled. Her breath hitched. Then her arm dropped. The gun fell, clattered, slid toward the edge. Lightning flashed. For one perfect moment, time held its breath. Bigfoot still hadn't moved, but his grip held firm. Behind them, another part of the bridge groaned, a beam shifting out of place. The whole structure shuddered. Mabel's boots slipped. She cried out. Then silence again. Then his hand. One arm free, he reached across the split in the planks like it was nothing. Caught her. Lifted her up with one hand like she weighed nothing at all. Cradled her just long enough for her to find footing. And then let go. She turned, looked up into his face. Rain dripped from his brow. His eyes didn't blink. Then he turned and disappeared beneath, back into the forest. Gone. No sound. Just the wind returning. The officers stood frozen. Wade lowered his hands slowly. Marjorie fell to her knees, the water soaking through her clothes, her lips moving but saying nothing. Caleb moved to her side, picked up the gun, held it until one of the officers stepped forward and took it. No words, just cuffs, just the shuffle of broken footsteps as they led her away. Mabel didn't speak, not for minutes, just stood where the planks had nearly broken, watching the place where something unexplainable had been. And when she finally looked up, her voice was small, but he didn't hurt her. Caleb nodded. He didn't need to. The walk back was silent. The trees no longer swayed. The rain had slowed to a mist, And the bridge, still standing, groaned quietly in the wind, as if exhausted. Back in the cruiser, Wade sat in the passenger seat, watching the river roll past in the darkness. The tape sat on the dash, the envelope sealed again, but something deeper had been unlocked, and nothing about this town would be quite the same again. The tide had pulled back overnight, low and stubborn, dragging the waterline out past where the cattails stood like forgotten sentries. What it left behind wasn't peace, just silence. Mud cracked in long, jagged veins. Salt crusted on the rocks. The kind of stillness that made everything sound louder. Boots sinking, breath hitching, even the way the wind skimmed the surface of the flats like it wasn't sure it should be there. The sky was the color of cold tin, flat and mean, and Marjorie Hart was running. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not anymore. But she had slipped the cuffs somewhere between the county lockup and the deputy's car, sometime after Wade turned his back for a single second too long. She ran like someone being chased by more than law, boots sliding, coat flapping behind her like wings that had never learned to fly. And the farther she ran, the more the land gave out beneath her. The dirt was no longer dirt. It was something softer, hungrier. It moved when she stepped, sucked when she pushed. She slipped, got up, slipped again. The flats were endless, gray-brown and shifting, the kind of place that blurred distance, made everything look close until it wasn't. And behind her, shapes moved. Quiet, deliberate. Men, yes, but also something else, something farther back, something that didn't hurry. Caleb stood on the rise overlooking the edge of the marsh. His coat was damp, his breath a soft ghost in front of his face. Beside him, Mabel clutched the wooden horse in one hand and stared hard at the path below. Her face wasn't afraid. It was something colder now, not angry, not bitter, just finished. Wade joined them, radio crackling on his belt. "She made it into the flats," he muttered. "There's no cover out there. We'll have her in 5. Caleb didn't nod, didn't speak. Just kept watching the slow churn of mud where footprints trailed and vanished. Marjorie stumbled again. Her knees hit hard. She cursed, wiped salt and grit from her palms, turned, and stopped. It was standing still, far enough away that she could pretend it wasn't real, close enough that she couldn't. Massive, motionless, not moving toward her, not away, just standing, blocking the only path out. The wind pushed her coat tighter against her chest. She turned again, but every direction was the same. Water creeping in slow from the edge. Softness beneath her that made her footing unsure. The creature didn't speak, didn't growl, just breathed. It was the breath that did it. That low, steady sound that vibrated more than it echoed. That let you know it wasn't afraid. That it had seen too many winters to fear one more broken thing. She screamed something that didn't land, words more ragged than clear. Tried to move. The mud grabbed harder. Every step stole her height. By the time the officers reached her, she was knee-deep in it. They came slow, didn't rush. Just stepped around the softer pockets like they knew the map of the land better than she ever would. One held out a hand. She didn't take it. So they pulled her gently, methodically. Not kindly, but not cruelly either. Just with the kind of practiced neutrality that comes from knowing justice wasn't always loud. Wade walked down the slope. "Stop next to her." "You're done," he said simply. She didn't look up. The creature had gone. No sound, no trail. Just mud where its feet had stood. Prints larger than any man's, deep and undisturbed. Caleb crouched beside Mabel. She turned her face up toward him. "What happens to people like her?" she asked. His breath was steady. "They get taken back." "To jail." He shook his head slowly. "To the part of themselves they tried to bury." The marsh began to refill, tide creeping back over the skin of the flats like fingers smoothing the edges of a wound. The prints remained a moment longer, then disappeared. At the station, Evelyn Pike sat in her corner office, rain tapping against the window. She turned over the envelope Caleb had delivered. Inside, every document from Box 9C. The tape, the insurance letter, everything. She picked up the phone. Dialed. FBI switchboard. Her voice didn't tremble. Back out by the bridge. Mabel stood barefoot at the edge of the forest, toes pressed into the moss. The air smelled of wet leaves and iron. The light was falling gold now, slipping between branches in long ribbons. "Do you think he's watching?" she asked. Caleb was behind her, arms crossed. "He always is." She turned the wooden horse over in her hands. It was drying finally. The mud cleaned away, the edges worn smooth from being held. "I don't think he hates people," she said quietly. "No," Caleb said. "He doesn't hate." "Then why does he stay away?" Caleb stepped beside her. "Because we forgot how to speak without hurting." They stood there a long time. The birds had come back. Not loud, just enough to know the forest was breathing again. Mabel closed her eyes, listened, not just to the birds or the breeze or the sound of the creek trickling far off, but to the silence between things, the place where language wasn't needed. And she smiled, a small, tired smile, the kind that comes not from winning, but from surviving, and from knowing that someone, something, had stood between her and the end. Not for glory, not for reward, just because it was right. The prints were gone. The story wasn't. Not yet. And the woods, they remembered. The post office in Gray's Harbor was small, tucked behind a feed store and a church that hadn't heard a full choir in years. The bell above the door had lost its voice, so when Evelyn Pike opened it that morning, only the creak of old hinges greeted her. She wore a navy coat too heavy for spring, gloves with the fingertips worn through, and that look on her face, the one she always wore when something long buried surfaced unexpectedly. She didn't speak to the clerk, just nodded once and made her way to the back, to the locked drawer marked Unclaimed. Return to sender. She opened it like she'd done 100 times before, fingers familiar with the weight of unanswered things. But today, there was something else. An envelope, yellowed and fragile, postmarked from somewhere in Montana. No return address, just one line scrawled in dark ink across the front. For Mabel. Evelyn's throat tightened. She slid the envelope into her bag and walked out without another word. Later that evening, she waited outside the town's small church. Weather-beaten siding, stained glass windows smudged by age and rain. The bell tower was cracked, the rope frayed, but someone had lit candles inside. The town hadn't seen a proper gathering in months, but word had spread. There were whispers now, about what had happened at the bridge, about what the girl had survived, about something massive seen holding up the beams like a ghost out of the old stories. Mabel sat near the front, knees drawn up beneath her coat, her hair still damp at the ends. Caleb sat beside her, still and silent, palms resting on his thighs. His face hadn't changed, but his eyes looked like they were carrying more than they used to. The candles flickered as the door opened, and Evelyn stepped in. The congregation didn't rise. They just watched as she made her way to the front and knelt by Mabel. "I think this is yours," she said softly, and handed the envelope to her. Mabel held it gently, like it might disappear if she blinked. She turned it over. Her thumb brushed the torn corner. The paper inside was brittle, but the words were still legible. A letter, folded in threes. She opened it slowly, and then she heard it. A voice, not loud, not imagined. Memory, written in ink and breath. "If you're reading this, then I'm not where I'm supposed to be. I'm sorry." Her lips moved along with the words, but no sound came. "I wish I could have told you this in person. I wish I could have watched you grow. But sometimes the world asks us to do things we don't understand." Her eyes blurred. Caleb placed a hand on her shoulder. "I hope you still have the horse. I hope you remembered to listen to the woods. They'll never lie to you, not the way people do." The room around her faded. There was only the letter now. "If you're reading this, it means you made it. Somehow, you made it." She pressed the paper to her chest. Her breath caught somewhere between a sob and a smile. She didn't look up. Didn't have to, because the back door opened just then, quietly, and a man stepped in, white-haired, lean, not frail, but carved down by time. His clothes hung loose on his frame. His hands trembled at his sides. His boots were still muddy, But it was the eyes. Those eyes. Mabel stood before she realized she was moving. "Tobin?" Evelyn whispered, breath catching. He didn't speak, just nodded once. His gaze never left the girl. Mabel took a step forward, then another, and suddenly she was running. She threw herself into his arms before he could kneel. He caught her, barely, staggering backward. But he didn't let go. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "I'm so sorry." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Later, when the candles had burned low and the last of the townsfolk had drifted back into the rain, Tobin sat at the front pew, Mabel curled against his side. Caleb leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the room with eyes that never fully rested. Wade entered through the side door, coat dripping, folder in hand. He looked older. He felt older. He walked up to Tobin and handed him the folder. "Your name's on the statement. You sign this, you testify, they'll believe you." Tobin opened the folder, flipped through the pages. "The truth," Wade added. "All of it." "I already buried that once," Tobin said, voice hollow. Wade didn't flinch. "You bury it again. It'll come back louder." Tobin nodded, took the pen, signed. Wade didn't smile, just nodded and left the room as quietly as he'd entered. Outside, the rain had softened to mist. Inside, Mabel tilted her head up. "You said I'd find the light again," she whispered. He looked down at her. "And you did," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. Evelyn stood near the altar, one hand resting on the old wooden pulpit, watching them with a kind of reverence. She spoke, not loudly, but clearly. "Sometimes justice doesn't come from a badge or a gavel," she said. "Sometimes it comes from a girl who won't give up, and a forest that remembers her name." No one answered. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of peace, of memory, of something ancient and kind. Outside, just beyond the last stained glass window, a figure stood beneath the trees, still, breathing, watching, only for a moment. Then it turned and walked back into the woods. The winter came quiet that year. No howling wind, no blizzards chewing through town, just a slow fade of color, like the world was holding its breath. At Pine Hollow, frost painted the windows each morning with thin silver veins, and the woods stood still under their white blankets, as if remembering something too old to say out loud. The cabin had changed, not in shape, but in the way it held warmth now. It was no longer a shelter for one. It was a house where someone laughed sometimes, where someone asked for more honey in their tea, where someone drew stories in the steam of the windows and waited for someone else to guess what they meant. Caleb watched her every morning. Mabel, 6.5 now, though she carried herself like someone who had walked through fire. She sat at the table by the window, sketching something new each day. Trees, birds, footprints, always from memory. And every page had him in it. Not Caleb, the other one. The quiet figure behind the trees, sometimes standing, sometimes crouched, but always watching. She wore her braces now. Caleb had carved the wooden frame himself, measured it against her leg with a craftsman's pride, sanded each edge until it no longer bit into her skin. The first time she stood on it, she shook. The second time, she didn't. By the third, she had made it to the porch, hand gripping the railing, breath puffing white into the morning air. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Caleb didn't say anything. He just nodded. And in the trees, something shifted. Tobin had taken to the garden. The man who once lived underground now spent most mornings kneeling in the frozen dirt, warming seeds between his fingers like they were prayers. He was thinner than Caleb remembered, but stronger too, in that way people get when they've finally stopped running from the worst of themselves. His voice was quieter than it used to be, but when he told stories about the mine, about the things he never thought he'd live to say, Mabel always stopped to listen. She didn't ask questions, just tilted her head like she was letting the words build a world in her mind. Sometimes at dusk she would disappear toward the ridge. She never went far. Just to the edge of the tree line, where the path bent inward and the air grew still. She'd sit on a stump, sketchbook in her lap, and wait. Not for noise, for quiet. She said that's when he came, not with footsteps, just presence. She said she could hear him breathing before she ever saw his shape. Once, she came back with a pine cone so perfectly broken open it looked like it had been split by hands. She placed it on the windowsill beside the drawing of the cabin and said, "He left this." Caleb didn't ask how she knew. He just added another log to the fire and nodded. The town had started to change too. Not all at once, not loudly, but things were softer now. People who used to cross the street when Evelyn Pike walked by now waved. Wade left his office door open again. There were still whispers. There always would be. But the fear that had lived under everyone's skin had started to dissolve. No one talked about the creature, not directly. But fences were left open more often, fruit left on stumps. Small things. Offerings, maybe. Or apologies. Mabel wrote sometimes. Not stories. Letters. Short ones. Folded and tucked under rocks by the edge of the forest. She never said what they were for. One afternoon, as snow began to drift gently from the branches, she stood in the clearing, arm outstretched, a folded note in her palm. She didn't move, didn't speak. She waited, long enough for Caleb to come to the porch, long enough for Tobin to step outside, breath catching, and then she placed the note on the stump and walked away. At dinner, she didn't bring it up, but later, when the wind shifted, when the fire in the stove crackled without warning, she smiled and said, "He read it." The next morning, a feather lay on the stump, not from any bird that lived near Gray's Harbor. Too long, too smooth, almost woven. The pages in her sketchbook began to change after that. More color, more shadow. She drew him not just in trees, but beside rivers, under moonlight, standing in the distance behind her wooden horse, like he had always been there, waiting. Caleb looked through the pages one night when she was asleep, each drawing more detailed than the last, each one still, but pulsing with something he couldn't name. He closed the book gently and set it on the table. The moonlight outside painted soft silver across the floor. He stood at the window a long time. He didn't see anything, but he knew better now than to think that meant it wasn't there. Sometimes presence doesn't need proof. It just needs faith. Near the end of February, the bridge was rebuilt. Wider now, stronger. Steel underneath, but wood across the top, to make it feel like it used to. There was no plaque, no ceremony. But Caleb and Mabel walked across it anyway, one slow afternoon, her brace thudding lightly on each plank, his steps echoing steady beside her. She carried the wooden horse. He carried a thermos of cider, and when they reached the middle, she stopped. She placed the horse on the railing and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice didn't shake. She didn't cry. She just said it like she meant it, like it was enough. And in the trees across the river, just beyond the edge of where the human world softened into something wilder, something stirred, she turned back toward the cabin. Caleb was already walking. She followed. At the edge of the bridge, she looked over her shoulder once more. No movement, just mist curling through branches. But she smiled anyway. At Pine Hollow, the garden began to thaw. The ice in the creek broke into pieces, and Evelyn brought over a basket of fresh seeds with a note that simply said, "Spring." Mabel sat on the porch that evening, blanket around her shoulders, sketchbook balanced on her knees. She didn't draw him this time. She drew herself, standing, hand out, and beside her, not touching, but close, a figure tall and kind, half in shadow, half in light. She wrote under it in neat block letters, "He taught me that silence still speaks," and the forest listened. Just before dusk, she walked to the bridge again, this time alone. She leaned over the railing, placed the drawing on the ledge, and whispered something too soft to catch. Then she let it go. The wind took it gently. It didn't fall. It drifted, like it knew where it was going. And at the edge of the woods, for just a breath, something the size of an old story paused on the ridge, turned, and vanished into gold. The trees didn't move. The birds didn't scatter. The world didn't end. But something shifted. A promise closed. A path kept. And a girl, once cast away, stood whole in the silence. Sometimes, the loudest truths are the ones whispered in the quiet. They don't come crashing through doors or flashing across headlines. They arrive slowly, carried in a breath, a gesture, a hand reaching through fear. And they stay with us not because they shout, but because they wait. Wait for us to be still enough to hear them. This story was never just about survival. It was about what comes after, about how we carry the weight of what tried to break us, and how, in the middle of all that hurt, there can still be something ancient and kind watching over us from the trees. Something that doesn't need words or praise or proof, just presence. There are places in this world where justice wears no uniform, where healing isn't loud, where hope lives in forgotten corners, on old bridges, in burned cabins, in the hush between raindrops. And maybe that's what matters most. Not the miracles that roar, but the ones that kneel beside us in the dark and hold us steady until we remember how to stand. And maybe kindness isn't something we're given. Maybe it's something we choose, over and over, in the quiet moments, when no one's watching, when it's easier to walk away, when we realize that listening, really listening, can be louder than speaking. We all have our forests, our bridges, our ghosts, but maybe we're never as alone as we think we are. Maybe the world hasn't given up on us. Maybe it's just waiting for us to notice it again. So if something ever comes to stand beside you in the middle of your fear, not to speak, not to save, just to be, let it. Sometimes the greatest grace doesn't come from being rescued. It comes from being seen. And to all of you who sat with this story, who stayed through the storm and followed the trail even when it blurred, thank you. You made space for a quiet story to breathe. That matters more than you know. If it moved you, even in the smallest way, let us know what you felt. Leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your silence, your questions. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories that whisper rather than shout, go ahead and follow, subscribe, and stay close. The forest isn't done speaking, and neither are we.